The winter of 1872 came early to the lava beds of Northern California. Sarah Running Deer pressed her baby closer to her chest as the cold wind cut through the thin walls of her makeshift shelter. The child, barely 6 months old, had not stopped crying for 3 days. Her milk had dried up weeks ago, and there was nothing left to give him. Around her, the Modoc camp was filled with the sounds of suffering. Children whimpered with hunger, and the elders sat in silence, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that this might be their final winter. The white settlers had pushed them from their ancestral lands along the Lost River, forcing them onto a reservation with the Klamath tribe, their ancient enemies. When that became unbearable, Captain Jack had led them back to their homeland. But now they were trapped. Sarah's husband, Stone Bear, had been killed 2 months earlier during a skirmish with the U.S. Army. She was alone with her baby and her elderly mother, White Dove, who could barely walk due to the harsh conditions. The three of them shared a shelter made of old canvas and branches, which did little to keep out the freezing temperatures. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Sarah knew he was dying. She had watched other mothers in the camp lose their children to starvation and cold. The sight of tiny graves marked with stones had become too common. She couldn't let that happen to her son, Little Wolf. There had to be something she could do. Captain Jack, their leader, tried to keep morale up, but even he looked defeated. The Modoc warriors were running out of ammunition, and their food supplies were nearly gone. They had been living on roots, bark, and whatever small game they could catch. The lava beds provided good hiding places from the soldiers, but they offered no food. That morning, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had heard rumors that some of the white settlers in the nearby town of Eureka were willing to trade food for Indian children. The children would be raised as servants, but they would be fed and have warm places to sleep. It was better than watching them die slowly in the cold. Sarah wrapped Little Wolf in her only blanket and began the dangerous journey through the lava beds. She had to avoid the army patrols that were constantly searching for the Modoc band. The rocks cut her feet, and more than once she had to hide in caves while soldiers passed nearby. The baby's weak cries might give them away, but she had no choice. As she walked, Sarah remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about the old days, when the Modoc lived freely along the shores of Tule Lake. They had been a proud people, skilled fishermen and hunters. The lake provided everything they needed, and their villages were filled with laughter and plenty. Now those days seemed like dreams from another lifetime. The town of Eureka was busy with activity when Sarah finally arrived. Miners, settlers, and traders filled the muddy streets. She pulled her shawl over her head, trying to hide her identity. Indians were not welcome in the town, especially Modoc Indians. If the wrong person saw her, she could be arrested or worse. Sarah found the trading post she had heard about and waited outside until the owner, a heavy-set man named Murphy, noticed her. She had practiced the English words in her head during the long walk. When he came outside, she held up the baby and spoke the words that felt like poison in her mouth. "Please, sir, I trade baby for food. Good baby, no trouble. Just need beans, anything to eat." Murphy looked at her with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. He had heard about the desperate conditions in the Modoc camp, and he knew there might be money to be made. White families in town sometimes needed help with their children and housework. An Indian child raised from infancy could be trained to be useful, but Murphy was also a careful man. Taking an Indian child during a time of war could bring trouble from the army, or from other settlers who might think he was sympathizing with the enemy. He looked at Sarah's desperate face and the weak baby in her arms. "I don't know about this," he said slowly. "These are dangerous times. The army is looking for any excuse to crack down on Indian sympathizers." Sarah's heart sank. She had walked all this way, risked everything, and now he might refuse. She tried again, her voice breaking with emotion. "Please, baby, die if no food. I give anything. Work for you, clean, cook. Just save baby." Murphy considered this. A desperate Indian woman might indeed be useful. She could work in his store and help his wife with household tasks, and if the baby survived, he could be trained to work as well. It might be profitable in the long run. "I might be able to help you," he said finally, "but not here, too many people watching. You come back tonight after dark. Meet me behind the store." Sarah nodded eagerly and spent the rest of the day hiding in an abandoned shed at the edge of town. Little Wolf had stopped crying altogether, which frightened her more than his tears had. She tried to give him water, but he was too weak to drink. As darkness fell, Sarah made her way to the back of the trading post. Murphy was waiting with a small bag of beans and some dried meat. It wasn't much, but it was more food than she had seen in weeks. "Here's what I'll do," Murphy said. "I'll take the baby and give you this food. You can work in my store for meals and a place to sleep in the storage room. But if anyone asks, you're my hired help, nothing more. And you never mention anything about trading the baby." Sarah looked at the food and then at her dying son. Every instinct told her to grab the baby and run, but she knew he would not survive another night in the lava beds. At least here he might have a chance to live. With tears streaming down her face, Sarah handed Little Wolf to Murphy and took the bag of food. As she walked away into the darkness, she could hear her baby crying weakly, calling for her. The sound followed her all the way back to the Modoc camp. When she arrived, White Dove was waiting anxiously. Sarah showed her the food, but couldn't bring herself to explain how she had gotten it. She simply said she had traded some of her jewelry to settlers. White Dove was too hungry and too grateful to ask more questions. That night, as Sarah chewed on the beans that had cost her everything, she made a silent promise to her son. Somehow, some way, she would get him back. But first she had to survive, and she had to help her people survive. The food would not last long, and winter was far from over. Little did Sarah know that her desperate act would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life but the fate of her entire people. The Modoc were about to face their greatest challenge, and the choices made in desperation would have consequences none of them could imagine. The beans lasted 3 days. Sarah rationed them carefully, giving most to her mother White Dove, whose health was failing rapidly. Each bean felt like a reminder of what she had sacrificed, and the guilt ate at her more than the hunger ever could. She had not told anyone in the camp about Little Wolf, instead claiming he had died of fever. The other women offered their sympathy, not knowing that her grief came from a very different source. Captain Jack called a meeting of the remaining warriors and their families. There were fewer than 60 Modoc left in the lava beds, and their situation was becoming more desperate by the day. The army had increased their patrols and escape routes were being cut off one by one. Food was so scarce that people were eating their leather clothing and boiling bones that had already been stripped of meat. "We have 2 choices," Captain Jack announced, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership. "We can surrender to the army and go to the reservation, where they promise we will be fed and housed. Or we can fight until the end, knowing that means death for most of us." The debate that followed was heated. Some of the warriors, led by Shanchin John, wanted to fight to the death rather than live as prisoners. Others, particularly the women with children, begged for surrender. Sarah found herself torn between both sides. Part of her wanted to fight, to make the white soldiers pay for taking her land and forcing her into this impossible situation. But another part of her thought about Little Wolf, alone and afraid with strangers in town. Old White Dove spoke up, her voice weak but firm. "What good is pride if our children are all dead? What good is our homeland if there are no Modoc left to live on it?" Her words carried weight because she had lived through other conflicts and had seen the cost of both war and peace. Sarah made another decision that would change everything. That night she slipped away from the camp again and made her way back to Eureka. She had to see her son, to know if he was still alive. The journey was even more dangerous now, as army patrols had increased and soldiers were shooting any Indians they spotted. When she reached the trading post, Sarah hid in the shadows and watched through a window. Inside, she could see Murphy's wife, a thin woman named Agnes, holding a baby. Sarah's heart leaped when she realized it was Little Wolf. He looked healthier. His cheeks had some color and he was not crying. Agnes was feeding him milk from a bottle and speaking to him softly. But what Sarah saw next made her blood run cold. Murphy was showing the baby to 2 well-dressed white men, and she could hear them discussing price. They were not talking about keeping Little Wolf as a servant. They were planning to sell him to someone else, possibly to people far away where Sarah would never find him. Sarah crept closer to listen to their conversation. One of the men was from San Francisco and was looking for Indian children to take back east, where wealthy families sometimes kept them as exotic curiosities or trained them as special servants. The price they were discussing was $20, far more than the bag of beans Murphy had given her. Rage filled Sarah's heart. She had sacrificed everything to save her baby's life, and this white man was making a profit from her desperation. She wanted to burst through the door and take Little Wolf back, but she knew that would mean death for both of them. Instead, she forced herself to listen and learn as much as possible. The man from San Francisco would return in a week to complete the transaction. That gave Sarah time to form a plan, but she had no idea what that plan could be. She was one woman alone, with no money, no weapons, and no allies among the white settlers. When Sarah returned to the lava beds, she found the camp in chaos. A group of young warriors had decided to launch an attack on a nearby army patrol. The attack had failed, and 2 of their best fighters had been killed. Worse, the soldiers now knew exactly where the Modoc camp was located, and a major assault was being planned. Captain Jack was furious with the young men who had acted without his permission. "You have doomed us all," he told them. "Now we have no choice but to fight, even though we cannot win." Sarah realized that the destruction of her people was about to begin, and she still had not found a way to save her son. The next morning, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go back to town, not to steal her baby, but to make a deal with the devil himself. Murphy was alone in his store when Sarah walked in. He was startled to see her, as he had assumed she had returned to the reservation or been killed by soldiers. Sarah had rehearsed her words carefully during the walk to town. "I know you sell my baby to man from San Francisco," she said directly. "I know you get $20, but give me only beans worth 50 cents. Murphy's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. "You have no right to come here making accusations. That baby belongs to me now. You traded him fair and square." Sarah stood her ground. "I have something you want more than money. I have information about Captain Jack and where Modoc warriors hide. I tell you everything, but first you give me back my baby." Murphy's expression changed from anger to interest. Information about the Modoc positions would be incredibly valuable to the army. The government was offering substantial rewards for information that would help end the conflict. But he was also suspicious of Sarah's motives. "Why would you betray your own people?" he asked. Sarah's answer came from the depths of her pain and desperation. "Because they already lost. Captain Jack know it, all warriors know it. Better some live as prisoners than all die in lava beds. I save my baby first, then try to save others." Murphy considered this carefully. The baby was worth $20, but information that helped the army capture Captain Jack could be worth hundreds of dollars in reward money. And if the war ended quickly, his business would benefit from the return of normal trade and travel in the area. "I'll need proof that your information is valuable," Murphy said. "Tell me something specific about Modoc plans, something I can verify." Sarah took a deep breath and revealed something that made her feel like a traitor to her own blood. Tonight, Captain Jack planned to move camp to Stronghold Cave System on south side of lava beds. Warriors will attack supply wagon tomorrow morning near Black Rock to get ammunition. Shanch and John lead the attack with 8 men. Murphy knew enough about the ongoing conflict to recognize that this information was indeed valuable. If he could get word to the army in time, they could set up an ambush and potentially end the war much sooner. "If this information proves correct," Murphy said slowly, "I'll give you back the baby. But you'll have to leave town immediately and never come back. And you'll need to provide more information about Modoc movements until the war is over." Sarah agreed to his terms, even though she knew she was signing the death warrant for some of her own people. As she walked back to the lava beds for what might be the last time, she wondered if saving one life was worth the destruction of many others. But when she thought of Little Wolf's face, she knew she would make the same choice again. The attack on the supply wagon happened exactly as Sarah had predicted. 8 Modoc warriors, led by Shanch and John, were killed in the ambush that was waiting for them. The army now knew that someone in the Modoc camp was providing information, and suspicion fell on everyone. Trust, which had held the band together through months of hardship, began to crumble. Captain Jack called another meeting, his face grim with the knowledge that they had been betrayed. "Someone among us has been talking to the soldiers," he announced. "Until we find the traitor, we can trust no one completely." Sarah sat in the circle with the others, her face showing the same shock and anger as everyone else. But inside, her heart was breaking as she watched her people turn against each other. The seeds of their final destruction had been planted, and she had been the one to plant them. 3 days after the ambush, Murphy kept his word. Sarah met him at the edge of town under cover of darkness, and he handed her Little Wolf along with a small bag of supplies. The baby looked healthier than she had seen him in months, but he seemed to not recognize her at first. When he finally realized who she was, his cries of joy mixed with her tears of relief, but the reunion was bittersweet. Murphy made it clear that their arrangement was far from over. You gave me good information once, he said coldly. Now I need more. The army wants to know about Captain Jack's plans for defending the stronghold. They're planning a major assault and they need to know about weapons, hiding places, and escape routes. Sarah clutched little Wolf close to her chest. The baby was alive and back in her arms, but the price of his life kept growing higher. I told you what I knew. I cannot learn more without making people suspicious. Murphy's expression hardened. That's not my problem. You made a deal and you'll keep it. If you don't provide useful information within a week, I'll report to the army that you were the spy all along. They'll hang you as a traitor. And what happens to the baby after that? The threat was clear. Sarah was now trapped between two worlds, trusted by neither side but needed by both. She returned to the Modoc camp with Little Wolf, telling the others that she had found him abandoned and near death during her search for food. Most people accepted her story, though some wondered why she had wandered so far from the camp alone. White Dove was overjoyed to see her grandson alive, but her experienced eyes noticed things that others missed. This baby has been fed cow's milk, she said quietly to Sarah when they were alone. His skin is clean, his clothes are new. Where did you really find him? Sarah couldn't lie to her mother anymore. In whispered words, she told White Dove the whole story, from the original trade to her ongoing deal with Murphy. She expected anger and condemnation, but instead found understanding and shared pain. You did what any mother would do, White Dove said sadly. But now you are caught in a trap that will destroy more than just our family. You must find a way to break free or the guilt will eat you alive from the inside. The old woman was right, but Sarah could see no way out. She was forced to continue gathering information about Modoc defenses and plans. She learned which caves held the ammunition, where the warriors planned to make their final stand, and what escape routes Captain Jack had prepared if the stronghold fell. Each piece of information felt like a dagger in her heart, but the alternative was losing Little Wolf again. Meanwhile, the army was preparing for its final assault. General Edward Canby had arrived to take personal command of the operation, bringing with him over 1,000 soldiers and advanced weapons. The Modoc had maybe 30 warriors left, armed with old rifles and limited ammunition. The outcome was never in doubt. Captain Jack made one last attempt at peace. He agreed to meet with General Canby and other officials to discuss surrender terms. Sarah overheard the warriors discussing the meeting, and she learned something that made her blood run cold. Some of the younger warriors, led by Hooker Jim, were planning to kill the peace negotiators during the meeting. They believed that assassinating the army leaders would throw the soldiers into confusion and give the Modoc a chance to escape. Sarah knew this plan would be the final disaster for her people. Killing peace negotiators would turn the entire country against the Modoc and ensure that no mercy would be shown to any survivors. But she also knew that reporting this plan to Murphy would make her directly responsible for whatever happened next. For 3 days, Sarah wrestled with her conscience. She watched Captain Jack prepare for the peace meeting, believing he was going to negotiate for the survival of his people. She saw the women and children in the camp, holding on to hope that peace might save them, and she held Little Wolf, knowing that her choices would determine not just his future, but the future of everyone she had ever loved. The night before the peace meeting, Sarah made her decision. She would warn Murphy about the assassination plot, but she would also try to save as many of her people as possible. She left Little Wolf with White Dove and made her way to town for what she hoped would be the last time. Murphy was waiting for her, eager for information about Modoc defenses. When Sarah told him about the assassination plot, his face turned pale. He realized that if General Canby was killed, the government's response would be swift and brutal, potentially affecting everyone in the area. This changes everything, Murphy said. I have to get word to the army immediately. Are you certain about this information? Sarah nodded, then made her own demand. I tell you this to save lives on both sides. In return, you help me save some of my people. When army attacks stronghold, many women and children will die. I want safe passage for those who surrender immediately. Murphy agreed, though Sarah wasn't sure if he could keep such a promise. She returned to the camp knowing she had done everything possible to minimize the coming disaster, but also knowing that she had sealed the fate of the Modoc resistance. The peace meeting took place as scheduled on April 11, 1873. Sarah watched from a distance as Captain Jack, Shanchan John, and other leaders met with General Canby and the peace commissioners in a tent between the two camps. She prayed that the assassination plot had been called off, that somehow peace might still be possible. Her prayers were not answered. Gunshots erupted from the peace tent, and she watched in horror as Modoc warriors emerged, having killed General Canby and wounded several other officials. The deed was done, and there was no going back. The army's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, artillery shells were falling on the stronghold, and soldiers were advancing from all directions. The final battle for the Modoc homeland had begun. Sarah gathered White Dove and Little Wolf and tried to find a safe place in the chaos. Bullets flew overhead and the sound of explosions echoed off the lava rocks. She could hear Captain Jack shouting orders to his warriors, trying to organize a defense he knew was hopeless. As night fell, Sarah realized that her information had indeed helped the army. They knew exactly where the Modoc weapons were stored and which caves provided the best defensive positions. The attack was coordinated and effective in ways that previous assaults had not been. But Sarah also saw that Murphy had kept his word about protecting those who surrendered. When small groups of Modoc women and children appeared with white flags, the soldiers did not shoot them. Instead, they were taken to a secure area away from the fighting. Sarah faced her final choice. She could stay with the fighters and probably die with them, or she could surrender and live as a prisoner with her son and mother. It was not really a choice at all. Under cover of darkness, Sarah, White Dove, and Little Wolf made their way to the army lines. When they emerged with their hands raised, soldiers quickly surrounded them and led them to the prisoner area. Sarah looked back once at the lava beds where explosions continued to light up the night sky. She was leaving behind everything that had defined her life, but she was carrying forward everything that mattered most. The battle continued for several more days, but the outcome was never in doubt. One by one, the remaining Modoc warriors were killed or captured. Captain Jack himself was eventually taken prisoner and would later be executed for the murder of General Canby. Sarah had saved her son's life, but the cost had been the destruction of her people's way of life forever. As she sat in the prisoner camp, holding Little Wolf while White Dove slept fitfully beside her, she wondered if she had made the right choices. The guilt would stay with her for the rest of her life, but at least her son would have a life to live. The prisoner camp was located 20 miles from the lava beds near the town of Fairchild. Sarah found herself among 43 other Modoc survivors, mostly women, children, and elderly men. The warriors who had survived the battle were kept in a separate area under heavy guard, awaiting trial for their role in killing General Canby. Life in the camp was harsh but predictable. The prisoners were given basic food rations, thin blankets, and shelter in canvas tents. It was more than they had possessed during the final months in the lava beds, but it came with the bitter taste of defeat and the loss of freedom. Sarah tried to focus on caring for Little Wolf and her mother, but guilt consumed her thoughts during the long, empty hours. White Dove's health continued to decline. The stress of the war, combined with months of poor nutrition and exposure, had weakened her beyond recovery. She spent most days lying on her bedroll, occasionally holding Little Wolf when Sarah needed to help with camp duties. The old woman never directly mentioned Sarah's role in the defeat, but sometimes her eyes held a sadness that cut deeper than any words could. Captain Jack and 5 other Modoc leaders were tried by a military court for the murder of General Canby. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks, and the outcome was never in doubt. All 6 men were sentenced to death, though 2 sentences were later reduced to life imprisonment. Sarah was called to testify about events leading up to the final battle, but she was careful to reveal nothing about her role as an informant. During the trial, Sarah learned that Murphy had indeed profited greatly from the information she provided. He received a substantial reward from the government and had used his connections with army officials to expand his business. Meanwhile, she sat in a prison camp with her people, watching her mother die slowly and wondering what kind of future awaited her son. The executions took place on October 3, 1873. Captain Jack faced death with dignity, speaking final words of love for his people and forgiveness for his enemies. Sarah watched from behind the camp fence as the man who had tried to lead his people to freedom was hanged for fighting to defend their homeland. She felt that part of her own soul died with him that day. After the executions, the government decided what to do with the surviving Modoc people. They would not be allowed to remain in their ancestral territory or join their relatives on the Klamath Reservation. Instead, they would be transported to Oklahoma, to land allocated to them among other displaced tribes. It was the final blow to any hope of maintaining their traditional way of life. The journey to Oklahoma took 2 weeks by train and wagon. White Dove died during the second day of travel, passing away quietly in Sarah's arms as the train carried them further from everything they had ever known. Sarah held Little Wolf close and whispered Modoc prayers over her mother's body, promising to teach him about his heritage even in their new exile. They buried White Dove in a small cemetery in Kansas, far from the lakes and lava beds where she had been born. Sarah placed stones on the grave in the traditional Modoc pattern and sang the old songs her mother had taught her. Little Wolf, now almost 2 years old, seemed to understand that something important was happening and remained quiet during the ceremony. The Modoc were settled on a small reservation near the town of Seneca in northeastern Oklahoma. The land was flat and treeless, nothing like their homeland. They were expected to become farmers, growing crops they had never seen before in soil that seemed foreign to their hands. Sarah was assigned a small cabin and a plot of land, along with government rations and basic farming tools. Life on the Oklahoma reservation was a daily struggle against despair. The Modoc were surrounded by other displaced tribes, all dealing with their own losses and adjustments. The government agents who supervised the reservation meant well in most cases, but they understood nothing about Modoc culture and insisted that the Indians abandon their traditional ways entirely. Sarah tried to make the best of their situation. She learned to grow corn and vegetables, traded with other families for supplies, and gradually built a small life for herself and Little Wolf. But she was haunted by nightmares about the lava beds and the choices she had made. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night, thinking she heard Captain Jack calling her name, only to realize it was the wind blowing through the sparse Oklahoma grass. Little Wolf grew into a bright, curious child who learned to speak both English and Modoc. Sarah was careful to teach him the old stories and traditions when they were alone. Though she knew this knowledge would be of little practical use in his future, she also struggled with how much to tell him about his father and the circumstances of their exile. 3 years after arriving in Oklahoma, Sarah received unexpected news. A letter arrived from Murphy and Eureka, delivered through the reservation's postal system. The trader had tracked her down through government records, and his message was both surprising and disturbing. Murphy wrote that he had been successful in business and had married Agnes, the woman who had cared for Little Wolf during those crucial days. They had children of their own now, and his conscience had been bothering him about his treatment of Sarah and her son. He offered to send money to help with their situation and asked if there was anything he could do to make amends. Sarah stared at the letter for a long time before showing it to her neighbor, an older Cherokee woman named Mary Ridge, who had become her closest friend on the reservation. Mary had her own stories of loss and survival, and she understood the complex emotions that Murphy's letter stirred up. "What will you do?" Mary asked. "This white man owes you much more than money can repay." Sarah considered her options. She could write back and demand a large sum of money, which Murphy might very well pay out of guilt. She could tell him exactly what she thought of his role in her people's destruction, or she could try to use this unexpected contact to create opportunities for Little Wolf. In the end, Sarah chose a different path. She wrote back to Murphy, acknowledging his letter but making no demands for money or apologies. Instead, she asked for something more valuable: information about opportunities for education and employment for Little Wolf when he came of age. If Murphy truly wanted to make amends, he could use his connections and success to help her son build a future. Murphy's response came quickly. He had contacts in California who ran schools and businesses, and he offered to arrange for Little Wolf to receive an education and job training when he turned 16. It wasn't perfect, but it represented a chance for her son to succeed in the white man's world without completely abandoning his Modoc heritage. Sarah began preparing Little Wolf for the possibility of leaving Oklahoma someday. She intensified his English lessons while also making sure he understood his true history. She told him about the lava beds, about Captain Jack's courage, and about the proud tradition of the Modoc people. But she was careful not to tell him about her own role in their defeat. Some burdens were too heavy for a child to carry. As Little Wolf approached his 10th birthday, Sarah realized that her own life had found a kind of peace. She had friends on the reservation, a small garden that provided food, and the satisfaction of watching her son grow into a strong, intelligent young man. The guilt would never leave her, but she had learned to live with it as part of the price she had paid for their survival. One evening, as they sat outside their cabin watching the Oklahoma sunset, Little Wolf asked the question Sarah had been dreading for years. "Mother, why did our people lose the war? Everyone says the Modoc were great warriors, but we ended up here anyway. What really happened?" Sarah looked at her son's earnest face and realized the time had come to share at least part of the truth. She began to tell him about the impossible choices people sometimes had to make, about the difference between surviving and truly living, and about the weight of decisions that affected not just yourself but everyone you loved. She didn't tell him everything, but she planted the seeds of understanding that would help him comprehend the full story when he was older and stronger. When Little Wolf turned 16 in 1889, the letter from Murphy arrived as promised. The trader had arranged for the young man to attend a vocational school in Sacramento, California, where he could learn practical skills while continuing his education. The offer included room and board and a job placement upon graduation. For a young Modoc man living on a reservation in Oklahoma, it was an extraordinary opportunity. Sarah spent weeks agonizing over the decision. Sending Little Wolf to California would mean separation from the only family he had left, but it also represented his best chance for a successful future. The reservation offered little beyond subsistence living, and she had seen too many young Indian men lose hope and turn to drinking or violence when faced with limited prospects. The night before Little Wolf was to leave for California, Sarah finally told him the complete truth about his early childhood and her role in the Modoc War. She explained about the desperate trade at Murphy's store, the information she had provided to save his life, and the guilt she had carried for 16 years. Little Wolf listened in silence, his face showing a range of emotions from shock to understanding, to something that might have been forgiveness. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time before responding. "You saved my life," he said simply. "Everything else that happened was not your fault. Our people were going to lose the war anyway. Captain Jack knew that, you knew that, everyone knew that except the young warriors who wanted to die fighting." His mature response surprised Sarah. She had expected anger, condemnation, maybe even rejection. Instead, she found acceptance and a wisdom beyond his years. "The white man Murphy used your desperation," Little Wolf continued. "He profited from our people's suffering, but you did what you had to do to keep me alive. I understand that now." The next morning, Sarah watched her son board the train that would take him back to California. For the first time since his infancy, she had given him a small pouch containing soil from their original homeland, which she had carried with her from the lava beds. She also gave him his father's knife and a piece of traditional Modoc beadwork that White Dove had made before her death. "Remember who you are," she told him as the train prepared to depart. "Learn everything you can from the white world, but never forget you are Modoc. Someday maybe you can help our people in ways I never could." Little Wolf succeeded beyond Sarah's expectations. He completed his education with honors and found work as a clerk in a law office in Sacramento. His intelligence and work ethic impressed his employers, and within a few years he was promoted to more responsible positions. But perhaps more valuable than the money was the letter Murphy had left with his lawyer, to be delivered after his death. In it, he acknowledged his role in the destruction of the Modoc people and praised Sarah's strength in rebuilding her life despite the impossible circumstances she had faced. It wasn't the apology she had hoped for during the worst years, but it provided a kind of closure she hadn't expected to receive. By 1910, Sarah had lived long enough to see the world change in ways she could never have imagined as a young woman in the lava beds. Automobiles were beginning to appear on the roads around the reservation. Electric lights illuminated the nearby towns, and her grandson Tommy was learning to operate one of those magical talking machines called telephones at Little Wolf's law office. Sarah, now 65, spent most of her days teaching the youngest children in the Modoc community about their heritage. The government schools tried to suppress Indian languages and traditions, but Sarah worked quietly in homes and family gatherings to keep the old knowledge alive. She had become the primary keeper of Modoc oral history, one of the few people left who remembered life before the war. Little Wolf's law practice had grown successful enough that he was able to hire other lawyers and take on larger cases. He had become a respected figure in Oklahoma legal circles, though he never forgot the price his family had paid for his opportunities. He frequently took cases without payment for Indian families who could not afford legal representation. The success brought its own challenges. Little Wolf's children were growing up more comfortable than most Indian families, attending good schools and having opportunities their grandparents could never have dreamed of. But Sarah worried they were losing connection to their Modoc identity. They spoke English better than their native language and seemed more interested in the modern world than in the stories of their ancestors. One day in 1912, Sarah received a visitor who changed everything. A young white woman named Dr. Margaret Stevens arrived at the reservation as part of a government study on Indian cultures. Dr. Stevens was different from the usual bureaucrats and missionaries who came to reservations. She was a trained anthropologist who genuinely wanted to learn about and preserve Indian traditions before they disappeared entirely. Dr. Stevens had heard about Sarah's reputation as a storyteller and keeper of Modoc history. She asked if Sarah would be willing to share her knowledge so it could be recorded and preserved for future generations. Sarah was initially suspicious, having learned to be wary of white people who claimed to want to help Indians. But Dr. Stevens proved to be different. She treated Sarah with genuine respect, learned some Modoc words, and showed real interest in understanding the culture, rather than just collecting information. Over several months, Sarah began to trust her, and eventually agreed to tell her complete story, including the painful details she had never shared with anyone except Little Wolf. The recording sessions took place over an entire year. Using one of the new Edison recording machines, Dr. Stevens captured Sarah's voice telling the traditional Modoc stories, explaining cultural practices, and recounting the events of the war. Sarah spoke in both English and Modoc, ensuring that future generations would have access to the language in its original form. But the most difficult sessions came when Sarah decided to tell the complete truth about her role in the war's outcome. She explained about trading Little Wolf for food, providing information to Murphy, and the guilt she had carried for 40 years. Dr. Stevens listened without judgment, recognizing the historical importance of Sarah's testimony. "Your story shows the impossible choices Indian women faced during that time," Dr. Stevens told her. "You weren't a traitor. You were a mother trying to save her child in circumstances no one should ever have to face. History needs to understand that complexity." The recordings were stored at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where they would be available to researchers and tribal members who wanted to learn about Modoc history. It was the first time anyone had bothered to record the Indian side of the Modoc War, and Sarah's testimony provided crucial insights that had been missing from official government accounts. Word of the recording spread throughout Indian communities across the country. Other elderly tribal members began reaching out to Dr. Stevens, wanting to tell their own stories before it was too late. Sarah had unknowingly started a movement to preserve Indian voices and perspectives on historical events. In 1915, Little Wolf was elected to the Oklahoma State Legislature, becoming one of the first Indians to hold such a position. His campaign focused on improving conditions for all of Oklahoma's Indian communities and ensuring that tribal land rights were protected. Sarah was proud of his success, but she also worried about the political enemies he might be making. During his first term in the legislature, Little Wolf introduced a bill that would have required Oklahoma schools to include accurate information about Indian history and contributions to the state. The bill faced strong opposition from those who preferred the simplified version of history where Indians were portrayed as obstacles to progress rather than as people with their own rich cultures and legitimate grievances. Sarah attended the legislative session where Little Wolf spoke in favor of his education bill. She listened as her son, speaking with the same dignity that Captain Jack had shown during peace negotiations 40 years earlier, explained why it was important for all children to learn the truth about the past. "History belongs to everyone," Little Wolf told the legislature. "Indian children deserve to know about the courage and wisdom of their ancestors, not just their defeats. White children deserve to understand the real consequences of expansion and settlement, not just the benefits. And all children deserve to learn that people can survive terrible circumstances and still find ways to contribute to their communities." The bill didn't pass that year, But Little Wolf's speech was reprinted in newspapers across the state and drew attention from educators who supported his goals. Seeds were being planted for changes that would take decades to fully bloom. As Sarah entered her 70s, she began to think about her own legacy. Little Wolf was successful and had children who would carry Modoc blood into the future. The recordings with Dr. Stevens ensured that Modoc stories would survive, even if no one was left to tell them in person. The money from Murphy's estate had been invested wisely and would provide for her grandchildren's education, but Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from seeing how the other Modoc families on the reservation had rebuilt their lives. The community was small but strong, maintaining their cultural identity while adapting to the modern world. Children learned both English and Modoc, practiced traditional crafts alongside modern skills, and grew up with pride in their heritage rather than shame. In 1918, during the final months of World War I, Sarah received news that would have seemed impossible 50 years earlier. Tommy, her eldest grandson, had enlisted in the U.S. Army and was serving in France. The same government that had nearly destroyed the Modoc people was now depending on young Modoc men to help defend American ideals of freedom and democracy. Tommy's letters from Europe described conditions that reminded Sarah of the desperate times in the lava beds, soldiers living in caves and holes in the ground, fighting for survival against overwhelming odds, making impossible choices about life and death. But there was one crucial difference. Tommy was fighting alongside soldiers from every background imaginable, all united in a common cause. When Tommy returned from the war in 1919, he was a changed man. He had seen the world beyond Oklahoma and California, had proven himself equal to men from every part of America, and had earned respect based on his actions rather than his race. Sarah saw in him the fulfillment of her long-ago hopes for Little Wolf's future. Sarah died peacefully in her sleep. On a warm spring morning in 1920, she was 75 years old and had lived long enough to see her great-grandchildren born into a world where being Modoc was a source of pride rather than persecution. Little Wolf found her that morning, sitting in her favorite chair with her beadwork in her lap and a smile on her face. The funeral drew people from Indian communities across Oklahoma and beyond. Dr. Stevens came from Washington to pay her respects. Former government agents who had come to know Sarah over the years attended the service. Even some of the families of soldiers who had fought in the Modoc War sent representatives to honor a woman they had come to see as a symbol of survival and dignity. Little Wolf spoke at the service, telling the assembled crowd about his mother's courage in impossible circumstances and her lifelong dedication to helping others rebuild their lives after tragedy. He didn't mention the specific details of her wartime choices, but he spoke about the burdens she had carried and the wisdom she had gained from her experiences. "She taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive," Little Wolf said. "It's about finding ways to live with honor and purpose even when the circumstances seem to make that impossible. She showed me that sometimes the hardest choice is not dying for your people, but living for them." Sarah was buried in the small cemetery near the reservation, her grave marked with a traditional Modoc stone pattern alongside a modern headstone. The headstone bore a simple inscription: "Sarah Running Deer, Mother and Teacher, Keeper of the Old Ways." Years later, when historians began to study the Modoc War in greater detail, they would find in Dr. Stevens' recordings a complexity and humanity that had been missing from earlier accounts. Sarah's story became part of a growing understanding that Indian history was not just about defeats and disappearances, but also about adaptation, survival, and the preservation of cultural identity under the most difficult circumstances. The recordings also revealed the moral ambiguity that characterized the Indian Wars. Sarah's story showed that there were no simple heroes or villains, only people trying to survive in circumstances that forced them to make choices no one should have to make. Her legacy became a reminder that understanding history requires listening to all voices, especially those that had been silenced or forgotten. Little Wolf continued his legal and political career until his death in 1945. His children and grandchildren became teachers, doctors, lawyers, and business leaders, all carrying forward the lessons Sarah had taught about maintaining cultural identity while succeeding in the modern world. The family never forgot that their opportunities had been purchased with a mother's desperate sacrifice and years of quiet determination to rebuild what had been destroyed. Today, Sarah's great-great-grandchildren live across the United States, successful in careers their ancestors could never have imagined. Some have returned to the sites of the Modoc homeland in California, now preserved as historical landmarks. When they visit the lava beds where their ancestors made their final stand, they remember not just the warriors who died fighting, but also the women like Sarah who found ways to ensure that the Modoc people would survive and eventually thrive again. Her story, preserved in those scratchy recordings from 1912, continues to teach new generations about the complexity of survival, the weight of impossible choices, and the power of love to overcome even the most devastating circumstances. It reminds us that history is not just about the famous leaders and dramatic battles, but also about the quiet courage of ordinary people who find ways to preserve what matters most when everything else is being destroyed.